Welcome to today's story, Unveiling the Shadows, a powerful tale about injustice, redemption, and the courage to stand against a broken system. Mark Benson, a successful black entrepreneur, enters his own company one morning only to be treated as an intruder. Anna, the receptionist, and Tom, the head of security, driven by their unconscious biases, humiliate him, doubting his very identity. What follows is a shocking series of events that leaves the entire company reeling, as Mark must decide how to respond to the blatant prejudice he's faced. Will this act of humiliation define him? Or will Mark take a stand that transforms everything? And what happens to Anna and Tom when they realize the true weight of their actions? This story challenges assumptions, reveals uncomfortable truths, and leads to a confrontation that will change lives forever. Stay tuned to see how this all unfolds, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more thought-provoking stories like this one. Comment below with your thoughts on how Mark might respond to such an injustice, and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. It was a crisp, clear morning in downtown Chicago. The towering skyline stood in sharp relief against the bright blue sky, and the streets below bustled with the energy of a new day. Inside Benson Innovations, the air was heavy with focus and quiet determination. Employees hurried back and forth, their footsteps soft on the plush carpet. In the spacious lobby, the click of keyboards, the hum of office chatter, and the soft rustling of papers created a rhythm that seemed almost like the heartbeat of the building itself. Behind the polished mahogany reception desk, Anna Miller sat, her perfectly manicured nails tapping lightly against her keyboard. She was proud of her role in the company, having worked her way up from a junior receptionist to the position of head administrator over the last 6 years. She prided herself on her professionalism, her attention to detail, and her ability to manage the comings and goings of Benson Innovations' high-profile clients. But there was something about today that unsettled her. A strange tension hung in the air, though she couldn't quite place it. She glanced up from her desk as the front doors slid open, and in walked a tall, well-dressed black man with an air of quiet confidence. He was dressed in an impeccably tailored suit, his polished shoes clicking against the floor as he made his way toward the front desk. Anna's stomach tightened. She didn't recognize him. He wasn't a regular visitor, and there was no meeting scheduled with a client she didn't know. Her eyes flicked down to her computer screen, scanning the list of appointments for the day. His name wasn't there. "Good morning," he greeted with a polite nod as he reached the desk. "I'm Mark Benson. I have a meeting upstairs." His voice was calm and steady, but Anna's suspicions were already rising. Something about his demeanor, too assured, too self-possessed, set off alarms in her mind. She frowned slightly, her fingers pausing on the keyboard as she scanned the appointment list again, more slowly this time. "I don't see your name on the list," she said, her tone cool but polite. Mark blinked, clearly surprised. "I'm the owner of the company, miss. I don't need an appointment to be here." Anna's stomach clenched tighter and her eyes narrowed. Owner impossible. She had met Mr. Benson, had seen his face in corporate emails. She felt the sting of insult in the man's calm assertion. No one just waltzed into her lobby making claims like that. She stood slowly, her posture stiff with irritation. "I'm sorry, but I haven't seen your name on any of our internal documents. We don't let just anyone into our executive offices without proper verification. You'll need to leave if you don't have an appointment." She turned her attention back to her computer screen, dismissing him. But Mark didn't leave. Instead, he leaned forward, his brow furrowing slightly. "Miss, perhaps there's been a misunderstanding. I don't need an appointment. My last name is Benson." There it was again, so calm, so composed. And it grated on her. "Owner," she repeated, her voice laced with sarcasm. She couldn't stop herself from scoffing. "You should know that we don't let just anyone in without clearance. You'll need to leave before I call security." Mark stood there for a moment, processing her words. His jaw clenched slightly, but he remained outwardly calm, though Anna could sense his growing irritation. "Miss Miller," he said slowly, as if speaking to a child. "I'm the founder of Benson Innovations. I don't need clearance to enter my own building." The irritation in his voice wasn't lost on her, and it made her blood simmer. How dare he talk to her like that? Didn't he understand the protocols? Anna's eyes gleamed with contempt as she crossed her arms over her chest. Is this some kind of joke you expect me to believe that you, she gestured vaguely at him, are the owner of this company? Her gaze flicked to the security desk, where Tom Higgins, the head of security, was watching the interaction closely. She gave him a subtle nod, summoning him over. Tom stood, adjusting his belt as he made his way toward them, his face a mask of authority. Mark watched the interaction, his patience wearing thin. He'd dealt with this kind of behavior before, and it never got easier. The assumptions, the doubts, the blatant disregard for his identity and his achievements simply because of the color of his skin. But today, in his own building, it felt like too much. I don't know what's more insulting, Mark muttered under his breath, the fact that you don't believe me or the fact that you think I'd lie about something like this. Anna smirked as Tom approached, planting himself firmly between her and Mark. The guard crossed his arms over his chest, his wide frame blocking Mark's path. Is there a problem here, Miss Miller? Tom asked, his voice steady and professional. Yes, Anna said, turning to face the security guard. This man is claiming to be the owner of the company, but he doesn't have an appointment, and I don't see his name on any of our records. He won't leave when asked. Tom nodded, his expression hardening as he turned his attention to Mark. Sir, I'm going to need to see some ID. Mark sighed, knowing that this was only going to get worse before it got better. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his ID, handing it to Tom. The guard took the ID and glanced at it, then handed it to Anna. She barely glanced at it before rolling her eyes. This can't be real, she muttered under her breath. You expect me to believe you just because you have a fake ID with the company's name on it. Mark's patience was now hanging by a thread. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, but he kept his voice steady. Miss Miller, I've built this company from the ground up. I've poured years of my life into it. I don't need your permission to enter my own building. Anna's eyes flashed with anger. You're not fooling anyone. People like you don't belong here. There it was. The unspoken sentiment laid bare. Mark felt his chest tighten with anger, the sharp sting of humiliation cutting deeper than he'd anticipated. But he refused to let them see how much it hurt. This is racism, he said calmly, though his voice shook with restrained fury. You're treating me like this because I don't fit your idea of what an owner looks like. Anna laughed bitterly, shaking her head. Racism don't make me laugh. I'm just doing my job. Tom, emboldened by Anna's confidence, stepped forward, his hand landing heavily on Mark's shoulder. You heard the lady? He growled. It's time to leave. Mark staggered back slightly as Tom's hand shoved against his shoulder. The physicality of the confrontation caught him off guard. He wasn't used to being handled like this, certainly not in his own company. The office was beginning to stir with activity. Employees had started to gather around the lobby, whispering and exchanging glances as the scene unfolded before them. Some were visibly uncomfortable, while others seemed to enjoy the spectacle. Mark, however, was acutely aware of every eye on him. The smirks, the indifferent stares. It was a public humiliation of the worst kind, not just being doubted, but being doubted in front of people he employed, the people who should have known who he was. His pride was being stripped away, piece by piece. Is this really necessary? Mark asked, his voice tight as Tom's grip on his arm tightened. You should have left when you were asked, Tom hissed, his face twisted with a mix of anger and authority. Now you're just making it worse for yourself. I'm telling you, this is my company, Mark repeated, though he knew the words were falling on deaf ears. His heart raced in his chest, a boiling mix of fury and helplessness. He wanted to shout, to scream, to let them know how deeply wrong they were. But he held back. He had to. This was his business, and no matter how angry he was, he couldn't let it all explode here. Anna stood with her arms crossed, watching with an air of satisfaction as Tom dragged Mark toward the door. The guard was rough, but not violent, just enough to assert his dominance. Get him out of here, she said coldly. He doesn't belong. Mark's eyes flashed with anger, but he kept his voice calm. You're making a huge mistake. Anna laughed again, the sound harsh and cutting. The mistake was letting you in here in the first place. Mark stumbled slightly as Tom pushed him again, nearly losing his balance. He could feel the humiliation burning through him as he was dragged toward the door. The entire office was watching. Some of them smirked, while others turned away, pretending they didn't see. But they saw. Everyone saw. The air was thick with tension, a bitter undercurrent of prejudice and power playing out in front of everyone. The truth was clear. He was being judged not on his accomplishments, but on the color of his skin. The sound of hurried footsteps echoed through the hallway, just as Mark reached the exit. Several managers stepped out of the elevator, their faces drawn tight with concern. They seemed to sense that something was wrong before they even fully understood what was happening. One of them, John Davis, a tall man with a sharp suit and graying hair, rushed forward, his eyes scanning the scene with confusion. His gaze landed on Tom, who still had a firm grip on Mark's arm. "What's going on here?" John asked, his voice laced with caution. His eyes flicked to Mark, and recognition dawned slowly. His confusion deepened. "This man tried to force his way into the office without permission," Anna replied quickly, her voice firm as she addressed the manager. "Hez claiming to be the owner of the company, but I checked the records, and there's no proof of that." John's eyes widened, and he turned his gaze to Mark, who was now adjusting his jacket, regaining his composure. The tension in the air became almost unbearable as John slowly realized what had happened. John's voice was barely a whisper. His face drained of color as he fully comprehended the situation. "Is it really you?" Mark's jaw tightened. "Yes," he said, his voice cold. "It's really me." John turned pale, his eyes flicking between Mark, Anna, and Tom, the horror of the situation finally hitting him. He took a step back, as though physically recoiling from the mess unfolding before him. "Mr. Benson, I'm so sorry," John stammered, his voice trembling with panic. "There's been a terrible misunderstanding." Mark said nothing at first, his cold gaze landing on Anna and Tom. The weight of his silence was heavier than any outburst could have been. Anna's face drained of color as the realization struck her. Her bravado collapsed, replaced by pure terror. She had just humiliated the owner of the company, her boss's boss. Her career, her future, everything she had worked for, felt like it was slipping away. Tom, sensing the shift, immediately released Mark's arm and took a step back, his own face paling. "Mr. Benson," Anna began, but the words caught in her throat. The guilt and fear overwhelmed her. Mark's eyes held a quiet, seething anger as he stared them down. His voice, when he finally spoke, was measured and calm, but there was a sharp edge to it. "You should reflect on how you judge people by their appearance," Mark said quietly, his words landing with the weight of a verdict. With that, he turned on his heel and walked out of the building, leaving behind a silence so profound that no one dared speak. Mark sat in the back of his car, staring out the window as the Chicago skyline blurred into a series of indistinct shapes. His mind was heavy, replaying the humiliation over and over again. His phone buzzed on the seat next to him, but he ignored it. He knew that people were reaching out, concerned colleagues, the company's PR team, and undoubtedly John Davis, but he couldn't bring himself to respond. The truth was, Mark had faced this kind of discrimination his entire life. From childhood playgrounds to boardroom meetings, he had always been aware of the assumptions people made about him. But today had been different. Today, he had been stripped of his dignity in front of his employees, in front of the very people who were supposed to know who he was. At home, his wife Rachel was waiting. She had always been his rock, and today he needed her more than ever. The moment he stepped through the door, she knew something was wrong. "What happened?" she asked softly, concern etched across her face as she wrapped him in a hug. Mark exhaled deeply, the weight of the day settling on his shoulders. "They threw me out of my own company, Rachel," he said, his voice thick with frustration. "They didn't believe me when I said who I was." Rachel's eyes widened, shock mixing with anger. "What? How could they—" "They didn't even check," Mark continued, sitting down heavily on the couch. "They just assumed I didn't belong." Rachel sat beside him, her hand resting on his knee. "This isn't just about today," she said gently. "It's about everything. You've worked so hard, but no matter what you accomplish, there's always someone ready to tear it all down." Mark nodded silently, knowing she was right. The emotional scars of racism ran deep, and today had reopened wounds he had tried to forget. "So, what are you going to do?" Rachel asked after a moment, her voice steady. Mark sighed, leaning back against the couch. "I don't know. Part of me wants to fight, to call them out, to make them pay for what they did. But another part of me is just tired." Rachel leaned in closer, resting her head on his shoulder. "You don't have to decide right now. Just know that whatever you choose, I'm here with you." Meanwhile, across town, Anna was facing her own personal fallout. She sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the letter she had drafted but hadn't yet sent to Mark. Her hands shook as she read through her words, though they all felt hollow now. What could she possibly say to make this right? Her father, George Miller, knocked on the door and entered without waiting for an invitation, as he always did. "You've been in here all day, Anna." "What's going on?" he asked, his voice gruff but concerned. Anna hesitated, unsure how to explain. "Something happened at work today." George raised an eyebrow. "Yeah, what happened?" Anna swallowed hard, her voice barely a whisper. I made a mistake. A huge one. Too humiliated someone at the office. Someone important." George frowned, clearly not understanding the full gravity of the situation. "So people make mistakes. What's the big deal?" Anna shook her head, tears brimming in her eyes. "Dad, it's worse than that. I didn't just make a mistake. I let my biases get the better of me. I didn't realize he was the owner of the company. I judged him by his appearance. And now I've ruined everything." Her father snorted dismissively. "So, what these days? Everyone's too sensitive about everything. You were just doing your job." But Anna's heart sank further. She could no longer hide behind that excuse. "No, Dad, I wasn't. I was wrong." By the next morning, the incident at Benson Innovations had spread like wildfire. Someone, perhaps one of the employees in the office, had recorded the confrontation between Mark and security, and now the footage was making its rounds on social media. It wasn't long before the story was picked up by news outlets, and headlines like "Tech CEO thrown out of his own company" and "Racial profiling at Benson Innovations" dominated the morning news cycle. Mark's phone buzzed relentlessly as messages of support, outrage, and even disbelief poured in. The story had struck a chord with people across the country. Mark sat at the kitchen table, his eyes scanning the headlines, but none of it made him feel better. In fact, it only made him angrier. The public outrage was growing, but for him, it was personal. This wasn't just a trending topic on Twitter. This was his life, his company, and his dignity that had been trampled. Rachel stood behind him, gently rubbing his shoulders as she read over his shoulder. "People are on your side," she said softly. "They're angry for you." "I don't want their anger," Mark replied, shaking his head. "I want real change. I want this to stop happening." At Benson Innovations, the atmosphere was tense. The viral video had placed the company under intense scrutiny, and the executives knew they couldn't sweep the incident under the rug. The board of directors scheduled an emergency meeting, and the PR team scrambled to prepare a statement, trying to contain the damage. John Davis, the vice president, was in a panic. He had been on the phone with the board all morning, trying to explain the situation. They demanded immediate action, and some were even talking about firing Anna and Tom to save face. Mark's dilemma now lay in how to respond. His best friend, David Foster, called him early in the morning. David was a lawyer, fiercely loyal, and always ready to fight for justice. "You need to sue them," David said bluntly. "They can't get away with this, Mark. You have to make an example of them." Mark sighed, his fingers massaging his temples. "I don't know if I want to take it that far, Dave. It's more complicated than that." "Is it?" David pressed. "This is your company. They threw you out like you were some random stranger. You can't just let that slide." Rachel, overhearing the conversation, gave Mark a supportive nod. But she also knew that David's aggressive approach wasn't always the best path. "You should think about it carefully," she added gently. "This isn't just about you anymore. This could set a precedent for how companies deal with these kinds of issues. You need to decide what message you want to send." Mark knew she was right. This wasn't just about his own anger anymore, it was about standing up for something bigger. But the weight of that responsibility felt overwhelming. Meanwhile, in a dark corner of the office, Anna sat at her desk, her hands shaking as she scrolled through the news articles. Her face was pale, and the pit in her stomach seemed to grow deeper with every passing minute. She had already been called into HR, where she was told that an investigation was underway and her job was on the line. Tom, too, had been summoned, and the look on his face told Anna he wasn't handling things any better than she was. In the break room, whispers followed Anna wherever she went. Employees who once smiled at her now averted their gazes or exchanged knowing glances. The viral video had turned her into a symbol of corporate racism. And though she knew she deserved the fallout, the shame was suffocating. That night, Anna sat alone in her apartment, the events of the past 2 days swirling in her mind. She hadn't been able to eat, and sleep was a distant memory. All she could think about was the look on Mark's face, calm, composed, but filled with a quiet fury that shook her to her core. The video footage had been dissected on social media, and the comments ranged from outrage to disgust. Strangers on the internet had labeled her a racist, and while she tried to tell herself that they didn't know her, that they didn't understand the whole situation, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were right. She had let her biases control her actions. She had been wrong. In desperation, she reached out to her colleague Lisa Brooks, a woman who had worked at the company for almost as long as she had. Lisa, an African-American woman, was known for her calm demeanor and her dedication to her work. Anna had always respected her, but now, more than ever, she needed her perspective. "Lisa," Anna's voice trembled over the phone. "Can I talk to you?" There was a pause on the other end before Lisa responded. "Sure, Anna. What's going on?" I need to understand," Anna said, her words stumbling over each other. "I don't know how I let this happen. I've always thought of myself as someone who's fair, who treats people equally. But now, I don't know who I am anymore." Lisa was silent for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "Anna, I'm not going to lie to you. What happened was bad, really bad, and it hurt a lot of people. But I don't think you're beyond redemption. The fact that you're asking these questions, that you're willing to confront this, means something." Anna's voice cracked. "But how could I have been so blind?" "It's not just you," Lisa said softly. "It's a system, a way of thinking that's so ingrained in our society that sometimes we don't even see it until it's too late. You've got to confront those biases, Anna. You've got to be willing to do the work." The words hung in the air, heavy with truth. Anna felt the tears spill over, and for the first time, she allowed herself to really cry, not just for what she had done, but for the person she had allowed herself to become. The next morning, Mark woke up with a sense of clarity. He had spent most of the night thinking about the incident, about the responsibilities that came with his position, not just as a CEO, but as a black man who had achieved success in a world that was still, too often, stacked against him. The company had called him multiple times, asking him to attend a board meeting to address the situation. They wanted to apologize, to make amends, but Mark wasn't interested in a simple apology. He wanted real change. He wanted this moment to mean something, not just for him, but for everyone who had been treated as less than because of the color of their skin. As he arrived at the office, there was a palpable tension in the air. Employees watched him with a mix of curiosity and uncertainty. He could feel their eyes on him, waiting to see what he would do next. John Davis greeted him at the entrance, his face pale and drawn with worry. "Mark," he began, his voice shaking, "we are so sorry for everything that happened. The board is ready to do whatever it takes to make this right." Mark nodded but said nothing, allowing John to lead him into the conference room where the board members sat in silence. They all looked at him with a mixture of guilt and fear, clearly aware of the storm that was brewing outside the walls of the company. Mark took a seat at the head of the table, his gaze sweeping over the faces of the men and women who had entrusted him with their company's future. "I want to be clear," Mark began, his voice steady but firm. "This isn't just about an apology. This is about systemic change. We need to address the biases that exist within our company, from the top down. I won't let what happened to me happen to anyone else." The room was silent as Mark outlined his demands. He wanted mandatory diversity training for all employees, starting with the executive team. He wanted an overhaul of the company's HR policies to ensure that incidents of racial bias were addressed swiftly and seriously. And most importantly, he wanted the company to issue a public apology not just to him, but to every employee who had ever felt marginalized or discriminated against. The board members exchanged uneasy glances, but they knew they had no choice. The pressure from the media, the public, and Mark himself was too great to ignore. "Consider it done," John said finally, his voice quiet. Mark nodded, standing up to leave. He had said what he needed to say, and now it was up to them to follow through. As he walked out of the building, a sense of peace settled over him. He knew that this was only the beginning, but for the first time in days, he felt like he had control over his own destiny again. The following day, Anna stood at her desk, feeling more out of place than ever. The usually comforting hum of the office sounded like a distant roar in her ears. She could feel the eyes of her coworkers on her, some filled with disdain, others with pity. But it wasn't their judgment that weighed on her the most, it was her own. She had written an apology letter to Mark, but the words felt inadequate. What could she possibly say to undo the damage she had caused? The guilt gnawed at her, a constant reminder of her thoughtless actions. For so long, she had been blind to the biases she carried, and now the veil had been lifted, leaving her raw and exposed. Clutching the letter in her hand, she took a deep breath and walked toward Mark's office. Each step felt heavier than the last, her heart pounding with anxiety. When she reached his door, she hesitated for a moment before knocking lightly. Mark looked up from his desk as the door opened, his expression unreadable. His calm demeanor, the quiet strength he exuded, only made Anna feel more ashamed. She had humiliated this man in front of his own employee, so could he ever forgive her? "Mr. Benson," she began, her voice trembling, "I wanted to—" Mark held up a hand, stopping her. "Anna," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "Sit down." Anna obeyed, sitting awkwardly in the chair across from him, her hands still gripping the letter as if it were a lifeline. "I know why you're here," Mark continued, his gaze steady. "And I know you want to apologize. But before you do, I need you to understand something." Anna nodded, feeling her throat tighten. "I'm listening." "This isn't just about me," Mark said, leaning forward slightly. "What happened between us, what you did, is part of a much bigger problem. It's not just about one mistake or one bad day. It's about the assumptions you made, the biases you didn't even realize you had." "I know," Anna whispered, tears filling her eyes. "I didn't realize how blind I was. Too thought I was a good person. I thought I was fair." Mark's expression softened, but there was still an edge of pain in his eyes. "We all think we're good people. But being good isn't just about what we say, it's about what we do. And when you judged me, you weren't just judging a stranger. You were enforcing a system that's been keeping people like me down for generations." Anna nodded, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. "I know, and I'm so sorry. I wish I could take it all back. I wish I could make it right." Mark was silent for a moment, studying her. Then he spoke, his voice quieter now. "I believe that you're sorry, Anna. But an apology isn't enough. What matters is what you do next, how you learn from this, how you change." Anna swallowed hard, feeling the weight of his words. "I promise you, I'm going to do better. I'm going to educate myself, and I'm going to fight against the same system I've been a part of." Her voice broke. "I don't know if you can ever forgive me." Mark leaned back in his chair, his gaze thoughtful. "Forgiveness isn't something that happens overnight. But I respect that you're taking responsibility. That's the first step." Anna felt a surge of relief, though it was tempered by the knowledge that the road to redemption would be a long one. She handed him the letter, unsure if he would even want to read it. "I wrote this for you," she said quietly. "I don't expect it to fix anything, but I wanted you to know how sorry I am." Mark took the letter, glancing at it briefly before setting it on his desk. "Thank you," he said simply. "We'll see what happens next." Anna nodded, her heart still heavy, but with a glimmer of hope. She stood to leave, feeling the weight of her actions less oppressive now that she had taken the first step toward making things right. As she left his office, she realized that the true work was only beginning. In the days following Anna's apology, The tension at Benson Innovations only grew. The video of Mark's removal had sparked a national conversation, and now all eyes were on him. The company had agreed to hold a press conference, and Mark knew this was his moment, not just to clear his name, but to address a much larger issue. The company's board had urged Mark to keep the statement simple, to focus on moving forward. But Mark had no intention of glossing over what had happened. He knew that this was an opportunity to confront the systemic racism that plagued not just his company, but countless others. The morning of the press conference arrived, and as Mark stood in front of the mirror adjusting his tie, he felt a mix of nerves and determination. Rachel stood beside him, offering silent support. She could see the weight of the moment on his shoulders, but she also knew that he was ready. "You've got this," she said softly, giving his hand a reassuring squeeze. "Just speak from the heart." Mark nodded, taking a deep breath. "I will." The press conference was held in the company's largest conference room, packed with reporters, employees, and board members. Cameras flashed as Mark took his place at the podium, the murmur of voices dying down as the room waited for him to speak. He cleared his throat, his eyes scanning the crowd before he began. "Good morning," he said, his voice steady. "I'm Mark Benson, CEO and founder of Benson Innovations. As many of you know, an incident occurred here recently that has sparked a great deal of attention, both within our company and across the country. An incident that, unfortunately, has exposed the deep-seated racial biases that still exist in our society." There was a ripple of murmurs throughout the room, but Mark continued, undeterred. "I was removed from my own building by people who judged me not on my accomplishments, not on my position, but on the color of my skin. And while that moment was deeply painful for me, it has also provided an opportunity for reflection. Not just for me, but for all of us." Mark paused, allowing his words to sink in. The room was silent, every eye fixed on him. This isn't just about one bad day. It's about a system that allows these assumptions to persist. A system that continues to marginalize people of color in the workplace and beyond. What happened to me is just one example of a much larger problem. And it's a problem we need to address now. He glanced at the board members seated behind him, many of whom shifted uncomfortably in their seats. But Mark wasn't finished. "As the CEO of this company, I take full responsibility for ensuring that we are part of the solution. That means implementing real change, starting today. We will be instituting mandatory diversity and inclusion training for all employees, including the executive team. We will be reviewing our hiring practices and HR policies to ensure that they are fair and equitable. And we will be holding ourselves accountable, not just to our employees, but to the public." Mark's voice grew stronger as he spoke, his conviction clear. "This is not a one-time fix. This is a commitment to long-term change. And I ask all of you, our employees, our clients, and the public to hold us to that commitment. We can't undo the past, but we can shape the future. And that's exactly what we intend to do." As Mark stepped back from the podium, the room erupted into applause. Reporters shouted questions, but Mark didn't engage. He had said what he needed to say. Backstage, Rachel was waiting for him, her eyes shining with pride. "You were incredible," she said, hugging him tightly. Mark exhaled, the tension finally easing from his shoulders. It's just the beginning. The weeks following the press conference were a whirlwind of activity. True to his word, Mark initiated a comprehensive overhaul of the company's policies and practices. The first step was the implementation of mandatory diversity and inclusion training, starting with the executive team. The company brought in outside experts to lead workshops and discussions, forcing employees to confront their own biases and understand the broader impact of systemic racism. For many, the training sessions were eye-opening. Lisa Brooks, who had been one of the most vocal advocates for change within the company, became a key figure in facilitating these conversations. She shared her own experiences with discrimination, helping her colleagues understand the subtle ways that prejudice can manifest in the workplace. For Anna, the process was both painful and necessary. The training forced her to confront the biases she had carried for years, biases she had never fully understood. But with each session, she grew more determined to change not just for herself, but for the people she had wronged. As part of the corporate reform, Mark also restructured the company's HR department, creating a more transparent and accountable system for handling complaints of discrimination. Employees were encouraged to speak up, and a new task force was formed to ensure that issues were addressed promptly and fairly. In addition, Benson Innovations launched a diversity initiative aimed at increasing the representation of people of color in leadership positions. Mark was committed to ensuring that his company reflected the diversity of the world outside its doors, and he worked tirelessly to make that vision a reality. Throughout this period of reform, Mark remained a visible and active presence within the company. He held town hall meetings, met with employees one-on-one, and made it clear that he was personally invested in the success of these changes. His leadership inspired others to follow suit, and slowly, the culture of the company began to shift. But not everyone was on board with the changes. Tom Higgins, the head of security who had been involved in Mark's removal, struggled to adapt to the new environment. He attended the training sessions, but it was clear that he wasn't fully engaged. After several warnings and a final review, Tom was let go from the company, a decision that sent a clear message there would be no tolerance for those unwilling to evolve. As the company moved forward, Mark found himself feeling a renewed sense of purpose. The changes he had fought for were taking root, and he could see the impact they were having not just on the company, but on the people who worked there. For the first time in a long time, he felt like Benson Innovations was becoming the company he had always envisioned. Months passed, and while the reforms had brought significant changes to Benson Innovations, there was still one unresolved issue: Anna's future with the company. Despite her sincere apology and her efforts to change, there was still tension between her and many of her colleagues. Some believed that she should have been fired for her role in the incident, while others, including Mark, believed in giving her the chance to redeem herself. The final decision came down to a meeting between Mark, Anna, and the board. The room was filled with a heavy silence as Anna sat across from Mark, her heart pounding in her chest. She had been working hard to prove herself, but she knew that this meeting could determine whether or not she had a future at the company. "Anna," Mark began, his voice calm but firm, "you've shown real growth over the past few months. You've taken responsibility for your actions, and you've worked hard to make things right. But we can't ignore the fact that what happened was serious. It damaged not just me, but the reputation of the company." Anna nodded, her throat tight. "I understand. I've been trying to learn from my mistakes. I know I can't undo what I did, but I'm committed to making sure it never happens again." Mark studied her for a moment, then leaned back in his chair. "I believe you," he said finally. "But this isn't just about me. It's about the company and the people who work here. They need to see that we're holding ourselves accountable." Anna felt a lump form in her throat, but she forced herself to speak. "If you think it's best for the company that I leave, I'll understand. He'll accept whatever decision you make." Mark was silent for a moment, his gaze steady. "I don't want to fire you, Anna. I believe in redemption. But I also believe that actions have consequences. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm giving you the option to resign on your own terms. You've worked hard here, and I respect that. But I think it's time for you to move on, to find a new path, one that allows you to continue growing." Anna felt a wave of emotion crash over her. She hadn't expected kindness from Mark Knott after everything that had happened. But the fact that he was offering her the chance to leave with dignity meant more to her than she could express. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I'll take the offer." Mark nodded, standing up and offering his hand. "I wish you the best, Anna. I truly do." Anna shook his hand, a sense of closure settling over her. She knew that this wasn't the end of her journey, but it was a new beginning. And for the first time in a long time, she felt hopeful about the future. As she left the office for the last time, she took one final look around the building that had been her home for so many years. She knew that she was leaving behind not just a job, but a part of herself. But she was ready for the next chapter. It had been 6 months since the incident at Benson Innovations, and the changes in the company were beginning to take root. Mark stood in his office, looking out at the Chicago skyline, feeling a sense of quiet pride. The path had not been easy, and there were still many challenges ahead, but for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of peace. The reforms he had implemented were making a real difference. The mandatory diversity and inclusion training had opened up conversations that had been long overdue. Employees were speaking more freely about their experiences, and the atmosphere within the company had become more collaborative, more inclusive. Most importantly, the company's leadership team was more diverse than ever before. Mark had made it a priority to recruit talented individuals from a wide range of backgrounds, and it was paying off. The company's innovations were stronger, more creative, and more reflective of the world they served. As he stood there, his phone buzzed on his desk. It was a text from Lisa Brooks, who had recently been promoted to a senior leadership position within the company. She had been instrumental in leading the diversity initiative, and her insight had been invaluable in helping the company move forward. Lisa, hey Mark, just wanted to say thanks again for everything. The new leadership team is really coming together. I'm excited about where we're headed. Mark smiled, typing back a quick reply. Mark couldn't have done it without you. Let's catch up soon. He put the phone down and turned his attention to the framed photograph on his desk. It was a picture of him and his family Rachel and their 2 children, Jacob and Amelia Taken, during a vacation the previous summer. The memory brought a warmth to his heart. Through everything, they had been his support system, his grounding force. Just then, Rachel walked into the office, a soft smile on her face. Hey you, she said, leaning against the doorframe. Thinking about how far you've come. Mark nodded, his gaze lingering on the skyline outside. Yeah, it's been a journey. Rachel crossed the room and wrapped her arms around him, resting her head on his shoulder. I'm so proud of you. You didn't just fix what was broken, you rebuilt it into something better. Mark exhaled, the tension in his shoulders easing with her words. It's not perfect yet, he said, his voice thoughtful. But we're getting there, and that's what matters. Rachel smiled up at him. The kids are proud of you too, you know. They see what you're doing, how you're standing up for what's right. You're setting an example for them. Mark's heart swelled with emotion. I hope so, he said quietly. I want them to grow up in a world where they don't have to fight the same battles I did. Rachel squeezed his hand. They'll fight their own battles, Mark. But because of you, they'll know how to stand tall through it all. Mark nodded, feeling the weight of her words. The world wasn't perfect, and change was often slow, but every step forward was a victory. And he had learned that sometimes the most powerful form of resistance was persistence, refusing to give up, even when the odds were stacked against you. Later that afternoon, Mark attended a meeting with the new leadership team. The atmosphere was different now. There was a sense of camaraderie that hadn't existed before. People from different backgrounds, different perspectives, were working together to build something that truly reflected the diversity of the world they lived in. During the meeting, David Foster, his longtime friend and legal advisor, presented a report on the company's progress. Mark, I have to say, you've managed to turn a really difficult situation into something incredibly positive, David said, a note of admiration in his voice. Not many people could have done that. Mark smiled, but his tone remained humble. It's not just me, he said. It's everyone here. We all had a part to play. As the meeting wrapped up, Mark stayed behind for a moment, watching as the team filtered out of the conference room. He had come a long way since that day when he had been thrown out of his own building, humiliated and disrespected. But rather than letting that moment define him, he had used it as a catalyst for change. Meanwhile, across town, Anna was beginning her own journey toward redemption. After resigning from Benson Innovations, she had taken some time to reflect on her life and the biases she had carried with her for so long. She had started volunteering with a local organization dedicated to promoting racial equality and educating people about systemic racism. It wasn't easy. Every day, Anna was confronted with the uncomfortable truths about her past actions, about the ways she had contributed to a system that had marginalized so many. But instead of running from those truths, she faced them head-on, determined to grow and to be part of the solution. One afternoon, as she was working on a project for the organization, her phone buzzed with a notification. It was an email from Mark Benson. Her heart skipped a beat as she opened it, unsure of what to expect. "Mark, Anna, I wanted to reach out and thank you for the letter you wrote. I've been thinking a lot about forgiveness, and while I'm not sure we're there yet, I do appreciate the effort you've made to change. I hope you continue on this path, and I wish you the best as you move forward." Anna stared at the email for a long time, tears welling in her eyes. It wasn't absolution, she didn't expect that, but it was acknowledgement. A recognition that she was trying to be better. And for now, that was enough. She had a long way to go, but she was committed to the journey. Every day was a step toward redemption, toward becoming the person she wanted to be, the person who didn't just talk about equality, but lived it. Back in his office, Mark sat down at his desk, feeling a sense of closure. He had fought for change, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been judged unfairly because of the way they looked. And while the fight was far from over, he knew that he had made a difference. He opened his laptop and began drafting a letter to his employees. In it, he thanked them for their commitment to the company's transformation and reminded them that the journey toward equality was ongoing. "This is just the beginning," he wrote. "We have a responsibility to keep moving forward, to keep challenging the status quo, and to ensure that Benson Innovations is a place where everyone, regardless of their background, can thrive. Together, we can build something better, a company, and a world where equality is not just an ideal, but a reality." As he finished typing, Mark leaned back in his chair, a sense of quiet satisfaction settling over him. The journey wasn't over, but for the first time, he felt like they were on the right path. Outside, the sun began to set, casting a golden light over the city. It was a new day, one filled with hope, possibility, and the promise of a better tomorrow. If you found this story moving and thought-provoking, be sure to subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories that challenge, inspire, and connect us. Like, comment, and share your thoughts below. Let's continue the conversation about equality, growth, and change together. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Thank you for watching and supporting our journey to tell stories that matter. Edith had always been a symbol of quiet strength to him, a woman who had endured so much in her life, from the loss of her husband to her battle with cancer, yet had always carried herself with grace. And now, here she was, fighting for her life, and there was nothing Luke could do to help her. "Edith," he whispered softly, leaning closer to her, "I need you to fight. You've made it through so much already. Please don't give up now." He wasn't sure if she could hear him, but he hoped his words would reach her somehow, deep in the recesses of her mind. He wanted her to know she wasn't alone. She had people who loved him, the community of Riverbrook, everyone who had rallied around her in her time of need. She mattered. As the hours dragged on, Luke found himself reflecting on their friendship. What had started as a simple mailman-customer relationship had grown into something much deeper. Edith had become a part of his life in a way he hadn't anticipated. She had been a source of warmth and kindness in his daily routine, a person he could count on for a kind word or a thoughtful conversation. He couldn't imagine his life in Riverbrook without her. At some point in the early hours of the morning, Megan arrived at the hospital. She had finished her shift at Riverbrook General and had come to check on Luke, sensing that he needed support. When she walked into the room, she found him sitting at Edith's bedside, his head bowed, his eyes red from lack of sleep. "Hey," Megan said softly, placing a hand on his shoulder. "How's she doing?" Luke looked up at her, exhaustion etched into his features. "Not good," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "The doctors are doing everything they can, but she's not responding like they hoped." Megan nodded, her heart heavy with sympathy. "It's always hardest when there's nothing more you can do," she said, her voice gentle. "But you being here, it matters. Even if she can't respond, she knows you're with her." Luke swallowed hard, his throat tight with emotion. I don't want her to be alone." Megan squeezed his shoulder reassuringly. "She's not alone, and she never will be." For a few minutes, they sat in silence, the weight of the moment pressing down on both of them. Megan understood the gravity of what Luke was feeling. As a nurse, she had seen patients in similar situations, and she knew how hard it was to face the uncertainty of whether someone you cared about would make it through. After a while, Megan spoke again, her voice soft but firm. "You know, Luke, whatever happens, you've done right by her. You've been here every step of the way. You've given her something so many people don't get, a friend who truly cares." Luke blinked back tears, trying to hold himself together. "I just want her to be okay." Megan nodded. "I know. We all do." The next day, something changed. It was subtle at first, just a slight improvement in Edith's vital signs. The nurses noticed it during their routine checks, and by the afternoon, Dr. Fields had confirmed that the antibiotics were starting to take effect. The infection, while still serious, was beginning to recede. Luke could hardly believe it when he heard the news. After so many hours of uncertainty and fear, this tiny glimmer of hope felt like a lifeline. He stayed close by Edith's side, watching her closely for any sign of improvement. Her breathing became a little steadier, her color slightly better, and though she remained unconscious, there was a sense that her body was fighting back. Dr. Fields approached Luke later that afternoon, his expression more hopeful than it had been in days. "She's not out of the woods yet," he cautioned, "but we're seeing some positive changes. Her body is responding to the treatment, and if things continue on this trajectory, there's a chance she'll pull through." Luke felt a rush of relief, though he was careful not to get his hopes too high. There was still a long way to go, but for the first time in days, he allowed himself to believe that Edith might survive this. That evening, Luke sat by her bedside again, his fingers gently brushing against hers. He had taken to reading to her from one of her favorite books, Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. It was one of the few books that Edith had talked about in their many conversations, a novel she had read countless times over the years. As he read aloud, his voice quiet but steady, Luke imagined that Edith could hear him. He hoped that his voice, familiar and comforting, would reach through the haze of her unconsciousness and give her strength. He wanted her to know that she wasn't alone, that he was still there, fighting alongside her. As the night wore on, something remarkable happened. Edith's fingers twitched in his hand, a small but unmistakable movement. Luke's heart skipped a beat, and he paused, staring down at her hand in disbelief. "Edith," he whispered, his voice filled with hope. There was no further movement, but the slight twitch had been enough to fill Luke with renewed optimism. He called for the nurse, who confirmed that Edith's condition was indeed improving. It was slow, and she still had a long way to go, but she was beginning to wake up. Over the next several days, Edith's recovery progressed. Her body, weakened by the infection and the cancer, continued to fight back, and slowly but surely, she began to regain consciousness. The day she opened her eyes for the first time since the setback, Luke was there, holding her hand and whispering words of encouragement. Her eyes fluttered open, and for a moment she looked disoriented, her gaze unfocused. But then her eyes found Luke's, and a flicker of recognition passed over her face. "Luke," she whispered, her voice weak but filled with emotion. Luke felt tears well up in his eyes as he squeezed her hand. "I'm here, Edith," he said, his voice shaking. "I'm right here." Edith blinked slowly, her lips curving into the faintest smile. "You stayed." "Of course I stayed," Luke replied, his throat tight with emotion. "I'm not going anywhere." For the first time in weeks, Luke felt a sense of relief wash over him. Edith was awake. She was still fragile, still fighting, but she was alive. And that was all that mattered. As the days passed, Edith grew stronger. She was moved out of the ICU and into a regular room where she continued her recovery. Luke visited her every day, just as he had before. And each time he saw her, she looked a little better, her skin a little less pale, her voice a little stronger. It was a slow process, but there was progress. One afternoon, as Luke sat by her bedside, Edith looked at him with a tired but grateful expression. "You saved my life, Luke," she said quietly, her voice filled with sincerity. Luke shook his head, his heart full of emotion. "No, Edith, you saved your own life. You fought through all of this. I was just here to make sure you didn't have to do it alone." Edith smiled softly, tears glistening in her eyes. "I couldn't have done it without you." For a moment, they sat in silence, the weight of everything they had been through settling over them. It had been a long, difficult journey, one filled with fear, uncertainty, and pain. But they had made it through together. As Edith's condition continued to improve, the doctors began discussing her discharge plans. She would still need ongoing treatment for her cancer, but the immediate danger had passed, and she was strong enough to leave the hospital. It was a moment both Luke and Edith had been waiting for, though it came with its own set of challenges. "I can't go back to living alone," Edith admitted one afternoon, her voice tinged with sadness. "I don't have the strength to take care of myself like I used to." Luke nodded, understanding her concerns. "Well, figure it out," he said gently. "You don't have to do this alone. There are options care facilities, home health aides. We'll find a solution." Edith looked thoughtful, her eyes distant. "I've been thinking about it a lot, and I think it's time to let go of the house. It's too much for me now. I've held on to it because of Harold, but I think it's time." Luke's heart ached at the sadness in her voice, but he knew she was right. Edith had spent so many years in that house, filling it with memories of her life with Harold. But now she needed a new beginning, a fresh start, where she could focus on her health and well-being. "We'll find you a good place," Luke said softly. "Somewhere where you'll be comfortable and well taken care of. And I'll visit you every day." Edith smiled at him, her eyes filled with gratitude. "I know you will." In the weeks that followed, Luke and Edith worked together to find a care facility where she could live comfortably while receiving the medical support she needed. It wasn't an easy decision, but Edith felt at peace with it. She knew she wasn't saying goodbye to the life she had built in Riverbrook, she was simply starting a new chapter. The day Edith moved into the facility, Luke was by her side, helping her settle in and bringing her familiar items from home, her favorite quilt, a framed photo of her and Harold, and a stack of books she loved. The room was small but cozy, with a view of a garden outside the window. Edith seemed at ease, and Luke felt a sense of relief knowing she was in a place where she would be cared for. As he sat with her that afternoon, watching the sunlight stream through the window, Luke realized just how much Edith had come to mean to him. She wasn't just a resident on his mail route, she was family. And no matter what the future held, he would be there for her, just as she had always been there for him. Several months had passed since Edith had moved into her new home, and life in Riverbrook had returned to its quiet rhythm. The seasons had changed, bringing the warmth of summer to the town. Luke continued his mail route, greeting the familiar faces of the town's residents and enjoying the simple pleasures of his routine. But there was something different, now a deeper connection to the community and a sense of purpose that went beyond delivering mail. Every afternoon, Luke visited Edith at the care facility. They spent hours talking, laughing, and reminiscing about the past. Edith had made new friends at the facility, and her health had stabilized. She was still undergoing treatment for her cancer, but she was stronger now, and there was a lightness in her spirit that hadn't been there before. One sunny afternoon, as Luke sat with Edith in the garden outside the facility, she turned to him with a thoughtful expression. "You know, Luke," she said softly, "I've been thinking a lot about how lucky I am. I've had a good life, but what I'm most grateful for is the people I've met along the way, people like you." Luke smiled, his heart full of warmth. "I'm the lucky one, Edith. You've taught me so much about resilience, about kindness, about what it means to really care about someone." Edith reached out and took his hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. "You saved me, Luke. Not just my life, but my spirit. I was lost for a long time, but you helped me find my way back." Luke felt tears prick his eyes, but he blinked them away, squeezing her hand in return. We helped each other. As they sat there in the warm afternoon sun, surrounded by the scent of blooming flowers and the soft rustling of leaves, Luke realized that he had found something he hadn't even known he was looking for. A sense of belonging, a deeper connection to the people around him, and a renewed understanding of what it meant to be part of a community. The story of Edith's struggle and her eventual recovery had touched more lives than either of them could have imagined. The people of Riverbrook had rallied around her, showing what it meant to truly care for one another. And in the process, They had reminded Luke of the importance of small, everyday acts of kindness, the kind of kindness that could save lives. As the sun began to set, casting a warm golden glow over the garden, Edith leaned back in her chair, her eyes twinkling with contentment. "It's a beautiful day," she said softly. Luke nodded, his heart full. "It really is." And in that moment, Luke knew that no matter what the future held, he and Edith would face it together, surrounded by the strength of their community and the unbreakable bond they had formed. Sometimes, the most unexpected connections can shape our lives in profound ways. If you've been moved by this story and want to hear more heartwarming tales like this one, make sure to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss any future updates. Every story has the power to inspire, and we have plenty more to share with you. Join us on this journey of storytelling, empathy, and community. Be a part of something bigger by subscribing, and together we can spread positivity, one story at a time. Let me know how it goes. In the months that followed, Ryan spearheaded a new task force within the department aimed at ensuring the responsible use of technology in policing. The Ethical Policing Technology Initiative (EPTI) was designed to oversee how new tools were implemented, making sure they adhered to strict privacy standards and weren't being used in a discriminatory manner. Ryan worked closely with civil liberties groups, tech experts, and community leaders to develop guidelines that ensured transparency and accountability. Officers were required to undergo specialized training on how to use these tools ethically, and new oversight measures were put in place to monitor their deployment. The program wasn't without its critics. Some officers complained that the new rules made their jobs harder, while certain tech companies pushed back against what they saw as unnecessary restrictions. But Ryan stood firm, knowing that without proper oversight, the technology could do more harm than good. During one particularly tense department meeting, an officer raised his hand, frustration evident in his voice. "With all due respect, Deputy Chief," he began, "why are we handcuffing ourselves? This technology can help us catch criminals faster. Why put so many restrictions on it?" Ryan met the officer's gaze, understanding the concern but remaining resolute. "Because our job isn't just to catch criminals," he said. "Our job is to protect the people, and that means protecting their rights too. If we start sacrificing privacy and civil liberties in the name of efficiency, then we're not doing our jobs. We're just cutting corners." The room was silent for a moment, and Ryan could see the wheels turning in the officer's mind. It was a tough balancing act, but Ryan knew it was necessary. The future of policing wasn't about brute force or unchecked surveillance. It was about thoughtful, ethical approaches that respected the people they served. 2 years later, the Ethical Policing Technology Initiative had become a model for departments across the country. Ryan had been invited to speak at several national conferences, sharing the lessons they had learned about balancing public safety with civil liberties. The success of the initiative had solidified his reputation as a forward-thinking leader in law enforcement reform. Jordan, too, had continued his advocacy work, pushing for nationwide adoption of similar standards. The two men, despite their different approaches, remained close friends and collaborators, each pushing the other to do better. One evening, after a long day, Ryan received a message from Jordan dinner at my place. When Ryan arrived, Jordan was already grilling steaks on the back porch. The smell of sizzling meat filled the air as they sat down to catch up. "You know, I never thought we'd be here," Jordan said as they ate. "When we started all this, I didn't think we'd actually get to a point where the system would listen to us." Ryan smiled. "I think we both underestimated the power of persistence." Jordan laughed. "You're right about that. But we're not done yet, are we?" "No," Ryan said, his tone serious. "We're not. But we're making progress." They clinked their beer bottles together, a silent toast to the years of hard work and the victories they had earned. The road had been long and filled with obstacles, but they had made a difference, one step at a time. As the sun set over the city, casting a warm glow over the skyline, Ryan and Jordan sat in comfortable silence, watching the world they had helped shape. The challenges they had faced, the battles they had fought, had all been worth it. They had built something lasting, something that would continue long after they were gone. Ryan couldn't help but think about the young officers coming up through the ranks, the ones who would carry on the work he had started. Officers like Naomi Green, who now led a unit focused on community engagement, were the future of policing. They represented a new generation that believed in fairness, justice, and the importance of doing things the right way. "I think the future's in good hands," Ryan said, more to himself than to Jordan. Jordan looked over at him, his expression thoughtful. "Yeah, I think it is." The two men sat back, content in the knowledge that while their work was never truly done, they had laid a foundation that would stand the test of time. And as long as there were people willing to stand up for what was right, there would always be hope for a better, more just world. A few more years passed, and Ryan Carter's career had reached heights he never imagined when he first joined the force. Now, as the chief of police, Ryan was responsible not only for the reforms that had already taken place, but also for leading the department through new social, technological, and ethical challenges. His success as a reformer had made him a widely respected figure, but it had also placed him under intense scrutiny. Every move he made, every decision he authorized, was dissected by the media and the public. The new debate consuming the city was centered around the rise in community-led safety initiatives. Many neighborhoods, particularly those that had experienced tense relations with the police in the past, were advocating for more localized, community-based public safety programs. These initiatives emphasized conflict resolution, mental health intervention, and restorative justice over traditional policing methods. Ryan understood the community's desire to have a more direct role in keeping their neighborhoods safe. After all, much of the progress they had made over the years was due to increased collaboration between the police and the public. But there were concerns within the department about the implications of scaling back traditional policing in favor of untested community models. One afternoon, as Ryan sat reviewing proposals for community-led initiatives, his deputy, Lieutenant Denise Martin, walked into his office. Denise had been one of Ryan's strongest allies during the reform years, helping him navigate the pushback from the old guard while building support among the rank-and-file officers. "Chief, you've seen the latest push from the city council, right?" Denise asked, a hint of concern in her voice. Ryan nodded, gesturing for her to take a seat. "Yeah, I've been going over it. Community Safety Initiative, they're calling it. They want to divert some funding from the police budget to support it." Denise frowned. "I get where they're coming from, but are they really ready for this? We're talking about removing traditional law enforcement presence in some of the most at-risk neighborhoods. Are we setting them up to fail?" Ryan leaned back in his chair, thinking carefully before responding. "I don't think we should look at it as us versus them. The goal is the same: keeping people safe. The way we've done things isn't the only way to do it. But if we're going to make this work, we need to be partners in the process." Denise nodded, her expression softening. "You think we can pull that off?" Ryan smiled slightly. "We've done harder things." A few days later, Ryan met with Councilwoman Elena Reyes, one of the main architects of the Community Safety Initiative. The two had worked together closely on previous reforms, but this new initiative was pushing them into uncharted territory. Still, Ryan was determined to keep the lines of communication open. Chief Carter, Councilwoman Reyes, greeted him warmly as they sat down in her office. "Thank you for taking the time. I know this isn't an easy conversation." Ryan smiled. "That's why we're here to have the hard conversations. We both want the same thing: safer communities." Reyes nodded, her tone more serious now. "Exactly. But we believe that safety doesn't always have to come from a police presence. These community programs have been shown to reduce violence and increase trust between residents. We want to give people the tools to resolve conflicts without always having to rely on law enforcement." Ryan took a deep breath. "I understand that, and I think there's a lot of potential here. But we also need to make sure that when people call for help, they get the response they need. There are situations where trained law enforcement is necessary, when violence escalates or when people's lives are at risk. We can't ignore that reality." Reyes leaned forward, her eyes thoughtful. "That's why we need your help. We're not talking about eliminating police presence, we're talking about complementing it. Working together with the community instead of always being the first line of defense. Ryan nodded. I'm open to that. Let's figure out how we can build this partnership. But we need clear guidelines on when the police should step in and when the community can handle things on their own. We also need to make sure that officers aren't feeling like they're being sidelined. If we're going to shift some of the responsibility, we need to bring everyone to the table. Reyes smiled. That's exactly what I was hoping to hear. Over the next few months, the Community Safety Initiative took shape. Ryan and his team worked closely with the City Council and community leaders to design a pilot program that would test the new model in several neighborhoods. The initiative focused on training community members in conflict resolution, mental health first aid, and de-escalation tactics, while keeping a close line of communication with the police for situations that required their involvement. Jordan, ever the advocate for grassroots solutions, was thrilled with the progress. "This is exactly what we've been talking about for years," Jordan said one evening over dinner with Ryan. "Empowering the community to take ownership of their own safety. If this works, it could be a game changer." Ryan nodded, though he remained cautious. "I want it to work as much as you do. But we have to be prepared for things to go wrong, too. If the community doesn't feel supported, or if the police feel like they're being cut out of the process, this could backfire." Jordan raised his glass. "That's why we have you keeping everyone on the same page." Ryan chuckled, clinking his glass against Jordan's. "Let's hope it's enough." As the program rolled out, there were successes and setbacks. In some neighborhoods, the community-led safety efforts resulted in a noticeable decrease in calls for police intervention. People began resolving disputes among themselves, and trust between residents and law enforcement improved. But in other areas, old tensions resurfaced. Some officers felt their authority was being undermined, while certain residents still feared police involvement, leading to hesitations in calling for help when it was really needed. Ryan worked tirelessly to address these issues, meeting with officers and community leaders, adjusting the program as needed. He knew this was part of the growing pains of any new initiative, but he also knew they couldn't afford to let the early successes slip away. The true test of the Community Safety Initiative came one night when a major confrontation erupted between two rival groups in one of the pilot neighborhoods. The conflict had escalated quickly, with rumors of violence spreading through social media. Normally, the police would have responded immediately, but this time, the community leaders who had been trained through the initiative decided to step in first. Ryan and his team were on standby, monitoring the situation closely. He had already instructed the officers to be ready to intervene if things got out of hand. But he was hoping that the community could de-escalate the situation without the need for force. For hours, tensions ran high as the trained mediators worked to calm both sides. The situation was touch and go, but just as things seemed like they were about to erupt into violence, a breakthrough happened. The leaders of both groups agreed to meet, with the mediators acting as go-betweens, and after a tense negotiation, they reached a resolution without a single arrest or injury. When Ryan received the call that the situation had been resolved peacefully, he felt a wave of relief wash over him. "We did it," Denise said, her voice filled with awe as she stood beside Ryan in the precinct's command center. Ryan nodded, his expression serious. "The community did it. We were there to back them up, but they handled it on their own." Jordan called Ryan that night, excited about the news. "This is huge, man, proof that this model works. People are going to take notice." Ryan smiled but remained grounded. "It's a big step, but we have to stay focused. This isn't a one-time thing. We need to keep refining the process, making sure that both the community and the police are working together." Months later, the success of the pilot program had attracted national attention. Cities across the country were interested in replicating the model, and Ryan was once again at the forefront of a new wave of reform. This time, the focus wasn't just on how police could change, but on how entire communities could take ownership of their safety while still collaborating with law enforcement. Jordan, as always, remained by Ryan's side, helping to push the legal framework for these initiatives across the country. The two friends had come a long way from that fateful night they had been pulled over. Their partnership had transformed the city and was now shaping the future of public safety nationwide. As Ryan sat in his office preparing for yet another interview with a national news outlet about the program's success, he couldn't help but reflect on how far they had come. The road hadn't been easy, and there were still challenges ahead. But they had built something lasting, something that would change lives for generations to come. Looking out the window at the city he had dedicated his life to, Ryan smiled. The work was never done, but for the first time, he felt truly optimistic about the future. They had started with a fight for justice, but now they were building a future of hope, partnership, and community-led safety. And as long as people were willing to work together, Ryan knew that anything was possible. A few years had passed since the Community Safety Initiative had been fully implemented across the city. The initiative had matured, becoming an example of how community and law enforcement could work together in harmony without one undermining the other. While there were still challenges, the overwhelming success had drawn attention from policymakers, activists, and law enforcement agencies across the country. Ryan Carter, now nearing retirement age, was in a reflective mood. After decades of service, he knew his time as the city's police chief was coming to an end. And while he looked forward to stepping back from the pressures of the job, he also felt the weight of leaving behind a legacy. Jordan, meanwhile, had taken his advocacy work to a national level. He was now leading efforts to pass federal legislation aimed at reshaping policing standards across the United States. They were both busy men, but their friendship remained as strong as ever. One evening, as Ryan sat at his kitchen table going over the plans for his final year in office, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Jordan Need to talk. "Big news! Let's meet tomorrow." Ryan smiled to himself. Jordan always had big news. Over the years, they had shared so many victories, setbacks, and countless moments of celebration and frustration. But it was their shared vision that had kept them moving forward. The next day, Ryan met Jordan at a small diner they used to frequent in their early days as young professionals. It felt nostalgic, sitting in the same booth where they had once dreamed of making a difference. Now, years later, they had done more than dream, they had transformed their city. "All right, Jordan, what's this big news?" Ryan asked as he settled into the booth. Jordan leaned forward, his eyes bright with excitement. "I've been talking with some of the top people in Washington. They want to take what we've done here with the Community Safety Initiative and turn it into a national pilot program. It'll be the first time this kind of community-driven public safety model has been tested on such a large scale." Ryan sat back, absorbing the news. "National pilot program? That's huge. What's the plan?" Jordan nodded enthusiastically. "They're looking for cities willing to try it. We'd take the model we built and expand it, tweaking it based on the unique needs of different communities. They want to bring me on as a national advisor, but more importantly, they want your input." Ryan raised an eyebrow. "My input? I'm about to retire, Jordan. I'm not sure I'm the guy for this." Jordan shook his head, a grin spreading across his face. "You're exactly the guy for this. You've seen this work on the ground. You've lived it. And the fact that you've been in law enforcement gives you the credibility to convince other departments that this isn't just some idealistic dream, it's real, and it works." Ryan rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "It's a big ask. I've spent my entire career in this city. I'm not sure I'm ready for something on that scale." Jordan leaned in, his voice quieter now. "I know you're ready to step back, but think about it. This could be the final piece of the puzzle scaling this idea across the country. You could retire knowing that what we built here is making an impact everywhere. Just give it some thought." Ryan didn't respond immediately, but he knew Jordan had a point. The work they had started in their city had the potential to be something even greater. But after years of leading a department, Ryan wasn't sure if he had the energy for another national fight. "You'll think about it," Ryan said finally, his tone cautious. Jordan smiled. "That's all I'm asking." As Ryan approached the end of his tenure as police chief, he began preparing his department for the transition. He had mentored several officers who were strong candidates to succeed him, including Lieutenant Denise Martin, who had proven herself to be a capable leader, and a dedicated advocate for the community first approach they had built. One afternoon, Ryan called Denise into his office. "Denise, you've been one of the strongest leaders in this department for years," Ryan said, looking across his desk at her. "I've been thinking a lot about the future, and I believe you're ready to take the reins." Denise's eyes widened slightly, though she had suspected this moment was coming. "Chief, that means a lot. I've learned so much from you, and I believe in what we've built together. But I know there's still so much more to do." Ryan nodded, his face thoughtful. "That's exactly why I know you're the right person for this. You've always been driven by the same things that pushed me: justice, fairness, and a commitment to serving the people. This department needs someone like you to keep it moving forward." Denise sat in silence for a moment, the weight of Ryan's words settling on her shoulders. "Thank you, Chief. I won't let you down." "I know you won't," Ryan said, his voice filled with quiet confidence. "And remember, you're not doing this alone. Lean on your team, and don't be afraid to keep pushing for change, even when it's hard." As Denise left the office, Ryan felt a sense of peace. The future of the department was in good hands. It was time for him to step back and let the next generation lead. With his retirement officially announced, Ryan took a few weeks to reflect on Jordan's proposal. The idea of taking the community safety initiative to a national level intrigued him, but he was also ready for a quieter life after years of public service. He spent more time with his family, enjoying the slower pace, but the thought of leaving the work behind nagged at him. One evening, Ryan found himself sitting on his back porch, the sun setting over the city skyline. The phone buzzed, and he saw a message from Jordan. "Still waiting on you, old man." "Time's ticking." Ryan chuckled to himself, shaking his head. Jordan never gave up on a fight. That night, Ryan made his decision. He wasn't ready to walk away from it all just yet. The work they had started was too important, and if there was a chance to make a lasting impact on a national scale, he wanted to be a part of it. The next morning, Ryan called Jordan. "All right, I'm in. Let's do this." Jordan's voice was filled with triumph. "I knew you couldn't resist. This is going to be big, Ryan. We're about to change the game." With the decision made, Ryan found himself in Washington, D.C., meeting with lawmakers, community leaders, and law enforcement officials from across the country. The national pilot program was being rolled out in 10 major cities, and Ryan was instrumental in helping to shape its implementation. His experience in building the initiative from the ground up gave him a unique perspective, and his input was invaluable as they adapted the program to fit the specific needs of different communities. Jordan, as always, was right there with him, leading the charge from the legal side, and ensuring that the program stayed true to its original goals of fairness, justice, and community empowerment. As the months passed, Ryan found himself energized by the work. He had thought he was ready for retirement, but this new mission gave him a renewed sense of purpose. The challenges were immense, but so were the rewards.
He watched as communities began to embrace the new model, as officers and residents, and as the seeds of change spread from city to city.
2 years into the national pilot program, the results were undeniable. The Community Safety Initiative had reduced violent incidents, built stronger bonds between law enforcement and residents, and empowered communities to take control of their own safety. The program was hailed as a success, and plans were already underway to expand it to even more cities. Ryan, now in his mid-60s, knew it was finally time to step back for good. His work was done. He had helped lay the foundation for a new era of policing and community collaboration, and he had no doubt that the leaders who followed would continue to build on that legacy. As he stood on the steps of the Capitol, watching the latest round of national reforms being signed into law, Ryan felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He had spent his life fighting for justice, for fairness, and for a better future. And now that future was being realized. Jordan stood beside him, grinning. "Well, old man, we did it." Ryan smiled, his eyes reflecting both pride and relief. "Yeah, we did." They stood there together, watching the crowds below, knowing that their fight had been worth it. The road had been long, the challenges immense, but they had built something lasting, something that would shape the future for generations to come. And in that moment, Ryan knew that while his journey as a public servant was over, his legacy of justice, reform, and hope would live on. Ryan Carter had officially retired from his role as chief of police and had successfully completed his work on the National Pilot Program. Now, standing on the balcony of his home in Denver, he gazed out over the city that had shaped his life. After decades of service, he was finally stepping away from the day-to-day grind of law enforcement. But it didn't feel like the end. In many ways, it felt like a new beginning. Without the constant pressures of his old position, Ryan found himself reconnecting with old hobbies and passions that he hadn't had time for in years. He spent more time with his family, his wife Elena, and their two grown children, Tyler and Sophia. The past few years had been especially hard on them with Ryan's intense focus on work, and now he wanted to make up for lost time. One sunny afternoon, Ryan and Elena took a walk through the park, something they hadn't done in what felt like ages. The air was crisp, the leaves falling gently around them, and Ryan felt a sense of peace that he hadn't experienced in years. "You finally have time to slow down," Elena said with a smile as they strolled along the path. Ryan nodded. "It feels strange, but it's nice. I think I forgot what it was like to just be present." Elena squeezed his hand. "You've earned it, but I have a feeling you're not done yet." Ryan smiled, knowing she was right. Even in retirement, his mind still buzzed with thoughts about how he could continue making a difference. But this time, he would do it on his terms, without the constant demands of his old job weighing him down. A few months into his retirement, Ryan was approached by a local university to teach a course on ethical leadership and policing reform. The idea intrigued him. He had spent years putting these principles into practice, but now he had the opportunity to pass that knowledge on to the next generation of leaders. The thought of stepping into a classroom full of eager students, young people, who would one day be responsible for shaping the future of law enforcement, gave Ryan a renewed sense of purpose. He accepted the offer and began preparing for the course. On his first day at the university, Ryan felt a twinge of nervousness as he walked into the lecture hall. The students sat quietly, some of them looking excited, others curious, all waiting for the former police chief who had gained national recognition for his reforms. "Good afternoon," Ryan began, standing at the front of the class. "My name is Ryan Carter, and am here to talk to you about the future of policing." He paused, scanning the room before continuing. "But before we talk about the future, we need to understand the past, the mistakes, the challenges, and the moments when we didn't get it right. Because if we don't learn from those moments, we'll be doomed to repeat them." The room was silent as Ryan spoke, but he could feel the students' attention. Their interest peaked. Over the course of the semester, Ryan shared not just the victories he'd had in his career, but the hard lessons he had learned along the way. He emphasized the importance of empathy, listening, and above all, the responsibility that comes with the badge. Teaching gave Ryan a new outlet for his energy and passion. It wasn't the adrenaline-filled, high-stakes work of policing, but it was just as important. These students were the future, and he was determined to equip them with the tools they needed to lead with integrity. While Ryan was settling into his new role as an educator, Jordan Thompson's star continued to rise. His work on the national level had gained him a reputation as one of the most respected voices in the fight for justice reform. Jordan had helped pass landmark legislation that put ethical limits on the use of surveillance technology, created national standards for police accountability, and expanded community-led safety programs across the country. One afternoon, Jordan called Ryan from his office in Washington, D.C., and with some unexpected news. "Ryan, guess what?" Jordan said, his voice buzzing with excitement. "They want me to run for office." Ryan chuckled. "Who's they? And what office are we talking about here?" Jordan laughed. "A group of people who've been following my work think I should run for Congress. They want me to take this fight from the courtroom to the Capitol." Ryan wasn't entirely surprised. Jordan had always been a fighter, and he had the kind of charisma and conviction that made him a natural leader. I can't say I didn't see this coming. Are you thinking about it? I am, Jordan admitted. It's a huge responsibility, but I've been thinking about how much more we could accomplish with the right people in power. If I can push for change at the highest level, why not go for it? Ryan nodded, though Jordan couldn't see it. You've always said we need people inside the system to change it from within. This might be your chance to do just that. I've been thinking the same thing, Jordan replied. It's a big step, but I think it's the right one. As they talked, Ryan felt a deep sense of pride for his friend. Jordan had spent his life fighting for justice, and now he was on the verge of taking that fight to the national stage. The following year, Jordan launched his campaign for Congress. With his years of legal experience and his proven track record in reform, he quickly gained support from a wide range of voters. His platform focused on criminal justice reform, civil rights, and economic equality issues that had been central to his work for decades. Ryan, though retired, was actively involved in the campaign, offering advice and helping Jordan connect with key community leaders. He traveled with Jordan to campaign events, standing by his side as they continued to push for the changes they had always believed in. On the night of the election, Ryan sat in the campaign's headquarters, surrounded by Jordan's team, watching the results roll in. The energy in the room was electric, but Ryan remained calm, reflecting on everything they had accomplished together. When the final votes were tallied, it was official: Jordan had won the election. The room erupted into cheers, and Jordan was immediately swarmed by supporters and media. But as soon as he had a moment, Jordan made his way through the crowd to Ryan. "We did it, man," Jordan said, grinning from ear to ear. Ryan smiled, shaking his friend's hand before pulling him into a hug. "You did it! I'm proud of you." Jordan nodded, his expression turning serious for a moment. "None of this would have happened without you, Ryan. We've been in this together from the start." As the celebration continued, Ryan couldn't help but feel that this was only the beginning of something even bigger. Jordan's election to Congress meant that the work they had started years ago, the fight for justice, fairness, and accountability, was now being carried forward on a national level. And while Ryan was stepping back, he knew that the movement would continue to grow, led by people like Jordan, who were ready to take the next steps. As Ryan watched Jordan deliver his victory speech later that night, he felt a sense of closure and fulfillment. The work they had done together had made a lasting impact, not just in their city, but across the country. They had faced countless obstacles, but through it all, they had never given up. Ryan's life was quieter now, but it was filled with meaning. His time teaching at the university continued to bring him joy, and the students he mentored were already starting to make waves in the fields of law enforcement, social justice, and community activism. His influence would live on through them, and through the work Jordan was doing on a national scale. In the end, Ryan realized that the fight for justice never truly ended. It was passed down from one generation to the next, evolving with each new challenge. But he took comfort in knowing that the work would continue long after he was gone. And as he looked toward the future, Ryan Carter was filled with hope that the lessons they had learned, the battles they had fought, and the progress they had made would lead to a world that was fairer, more just, and filled with opportunity for all. As the story draws to a close, we want to thank you for joining us on this powerful journey of justice, friendship, and change. If you enjoyed this story and want more thought-provoking content like this, be sure to subscribe to our channel. Your support means the world to us, and it helps us continue sharing stories that inspire, challenge, and make a difference. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss an update, and feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear where you're watching from and what impact this story had on you. Subscribe now for more impactful stories and content that makes you think. We value your feedback, so if you enjoyed this story, leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for being part of our storytelling community, and stay tuned for more stories that remind us all that no matter how hard things get, we are never truly alone.